Dr. Calloway humiliated her in front of everyone, unaware that she was his new boss. He believed he could treat a black woman this way simply because he was used to seeing them in lower positions. But when the truth came to light, his world began to crumble, along with his authority. How Jessica responded would shock even those who had seen much in life. But let's go back to the beginning. Jessica Harris stood at the entrance of the city clinic, preparing for her first shift as the new chief medical officer. She had been in the medical field for several years and knew how important it was not only to treat patients, but also to fight injustice within the healthcare system. This clinic, located in a poor neighborhood, was known for its problems, including outdated equipment, underfunding, and chronic neglect from the authorities. But for Jessica, this was an opportunity not only to change things, but also to prove she was worthy of her new position. Inside the clinic, the usual morning chaos was unfolding. Nurses rushed from one patient to another, and doctors reviewed medical records. However, the atmosphere wasn't welcoming. As soon as she walked in, some staff members glanced at her with discontent. This was the typical reaction to a new boss, especially when the boss was a young African-American woman. Something's not right here, Jessica thought, but she decided to ignore it for now. She knew that respect had to be earned, and she was ready for that challenge. At that moment, Dr. James Calloway passed by. He had been there for over a decade and had a reputation as an experienced but abrasive doctor. James barely acknowledged Jessica, even though he already knew who she was. In his mind, she was just another nurse, someone who could hardly change the clinic. Such attitudes were nothing new to Jessica. She had faced them at every step of her career. When James stumbled upon a patient's medical chart left out of place, his patience snapped. He approached a group of nurses, Jessica among them, and without acknowledging her presence, started scolding them. Who the hell is responsible for this mess? If you can't even organize charts properly, how do you plan to treat people? Jessica, knowing that her new role was to improve the clinic's workflow, chose not to stay silent. She calmly stepped forward and said, "Dr. Calloway, I can help resolve this, but let's try to speak respectfully to one another." Her response caught James off guard. He froze for a second, his face tense with anger. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" he replied sarcastically, looking down at Jessica with condescending disdain. "Maybe you should stick to your duties instead of trying to take charge of things you can't handle." The other staff members, witnessing the scene, remained silent, fearing that any intervention would worsen the situation. Jessica felt the tension but decided not to show weakness. She knew that if she backed down now, it would only reinforce the unjust treatment she was facing. "Dr. Calloway," she said firmly but without aggression, "everyone here is working for the benefit of the patients. If there's a problem, we need to solve it together." Her words didn't calm James. He abruptly turned around and stormed off without another word, leaving Jessica and the others in silence. But Jessica knew. This was only the beginning. A few hours after her first encounter with Dr. Calloway, Jessica continued observing the clinic's operations. She needed to understand how things were organized and where improvements could be made. She saw chaos, which was mostly caused not by staff incompetence, but by outdated systems and the lack of resources. Jessica had already begun making mental notes on how to fix these issues, but her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Dr. Calloway was standing at the reception desk, waving a folder of medical records. He was clearly furious. "Who's responsible for this mess?" His voice was loud, barely containing his irritation. Patients in the waiting area started to glance over, while nurses and junior staff avoided eye contact. James didn't tolerate mistakes and openly expressed his dissatisfaction. Standing nearby, Jessica immediately realized that this was not just a work-related incident. His frustration was directed at her role, her presence in the clinic. He knew who she was, and now he sought an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority in front of the entire staff. Calloway moved straight toward Jessica, his gaze cold. "Looks like there's a new order around here now that we have a new boss," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But before making any big decisions, maybe you, he emphasized the word you, should at least figure out how medical records work, or is that too complicated? His tone was overtly condescending, and there was no subtlety in his words. He publicly questioned her competence and professionalism, fully aware that Jessica, as the new chief medical officer, needed to establish her authority. However, his attack wasn't driven by professional disagreements. It was motivated by his personal disdain for her as a leader, and, likely, as a black woman who had risen to a position of power. Jessica knew that this was a critical moment. If she backed down now, her authority would be undermined for a long time. She took a deep breath and straightened up, meeting Dr. Calloway's eyes. "Dr. Calloway," she said calmly but firmly, "I believe the problem here is not with the records, but with how we communicate with each other." Her voice was steady, though the tension in the room was palpable. Her response only fueled Calloway's anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a younger woman. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job?" he shouted, raising his voice even more, making sure everyone in the clinic heard him. He clenched his fists and stepped closer to Jessica. "Maybe instead of telling people what to do, you should try handling the basics first. Or is that too much for you to understand?" The room fell silent. The staff, patients, and even the security personnel in the reception area were watching with tense expressions. Jessica could feel everyone's eyes on her. Inside, she felt the indignation boiling, but she knew that if she let her emotions show or responded in the same tone, it would only reinforce the notion that she didn't belong in her position. "Dr. Calloway," she said evenly, "I'm here to work alongside you. If you have questions or suggestions about how to improve the processes, I'm always open to discussing them, but I ask that we keep these discussions professional." Her words were calm but carried the weight of authority. Calloway hesitated for a moment, seemingly taken aback by her composed response. But instead of apologizing or backing down, he merely scoffed and tossed the folder onto the counter. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking away, his back rigid with anger. He left, but the tension remained. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Jessica knew this was only the first of many such confrontations. She realized that earning respect in this clinic meant not just proving her skills, but also fighting against deeply ingrained biases and prejudices that would not be easily overcome. A few moments after the tense encounter with Dr. Calloway, Jessica noticed the clinic's administrator, Mr. Williams, approaching the nurses' station. He was a tall man with graying temples, someone who had worked in the clinic for many years and knew almost everyone. In his hands, he held a folder of documents, and a faint concern was visible on his face. Mr. Williams stopped at the desk and glanced at the nurses, who stood in awkward silence after the incident. "Did something happen?" he asked quietly, sensing the tense atmosphere. But no one had a chance to respond. His gaze had already fallen on Jessica and Calloway, who were standing on opposite sides of the room. He immediately understood that something serious had taken place. Stepping closer, Mr. Williams caught sight of Calloway, who was still visibly seething. But there was something more important he needed to clarify. "Dr. Calloway, I hope you've already met our new chief medical officer, Dr. Jessica Harris," he said, in as neutral a tone as possible. A moment of silence hung in the air, as if time had stopped for a few seconds. Everyone around, those who heard these words, froze, staring at Calloway to see his reaction. Calloway slowly turned and looked at Jessica, his face shifting quickly, from surprise to shock to shame. He realized that the woman he had just publicly humiliated and tried to put in her place was his new boss. Jessica Harris had been appointed the chief medical officer of this clinic, and now it was her responsibility to reform the place where he had worked for so many years. For a few moments, Calloway was at a loss for words. His voice failed him, and confusion filled his eyes. Everyone around watched him. He wanted to say something, but he understood that any word he uttered would only make the situation worse. "Chief Medical Officer?" he whispered, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Jessica, Seeing his bewilderment didn't escalate the situation. She fully understood that this was a moment when she could assert her authority and demonstrate her power, but instead, she chose to maintain dignity and respect. She stepped forward calmly and said, "Yes, Dr. Calloway, I've been appointed as the Chief Medical Officer of this clinic. I'm here to improve working conditions and the quality of care for our patients, and I hope for your cooperation." Her voice was steady and calm, but there was a firmness in it. Jessica wasn't about to let the situation spiral out of control, nor did she want to humiliate anyone, even someone like Calloway, who had shown open prejudice. Calloway was in shock. He glanced around at his colleagues, many of whom were now looking at him with curious expressions, waiting for his next move. He quickly realized that this moment could have serious consequences for his reputation. Finally, understanding that he was in a difficult position, he muttered, I didn't know. I'm sorry." But his words lacked sincerity. It was more a formality, driven by his vulnerability. Jessica nodded, accepting his apology, though she knew it wasn't genuine. She understood that her task ahead was not just to change Calloway's attitude, but to tackle the deep-rooted biases of many others in the clinic who might share his sentiments. Mr. Williams watched the scene and nodded approvingly, impressed with how Jessica had handled the situation. He knew she had a long road ahead, but he believed she was up to the challenge. "If you need anything, Dr. Harris," he said, addressing her with respect, "just let me know. We're here to support you." Jessica thanked him, though her thoughts were already focused on the future. She knew this incident was just the beginning of a long journey. Her mission was not only to implement reforms in the clinic, but also to overcome the resistance of those who clung to outdated views and were reluctant to accept change. After the truth about Jessica Harris's position came to light, Dr. James Calloway retreated to his office. He shut the door behind him and sank heavily into his chair. The silence in the room was deafening. His thoughts whirled around uncontrollably, preventing him from focusing. The echo of Mr. Williams's words kept replaying in his mind. "Our new Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jessica Harris." Over and over, Calloway replayed the recent confrontation in his head. How could he have made such a grave mistake? How could he allow himself to publicly humiliate the new leader of the clinic, an African-American woman, without even realizing it? The confidence he'd once relied on so heavily was now crumbling. He was used to feeling like the person in charge, someone people listened to and respected. But now, everything had changed. This moment triggered a wave of internal doubt and anger. Calloway tried to justify his behavior, but deep down, he knew it was something else. There was a subtle, unsettling feeling that the world around him was shifting, that the old ways were breaking down. He had been certain of his position, but now, Jessica's arrival threatened to strip him of the authority and respect he had held on to for so long. Calloway couldn't deny that part of his frustration was aimed not just at Jessica, but at the growing number of young, ambitious African Americans entering the healthcare system. He knew that many of them were well-educated and deserving of their roles, but somewhere deep inside, he was still bound to outdated prejudices that he had never confronted head-on. He remembered how, for years, he had relied on his status and connections within the clinic. Many of his colleagues and subordinates feared his strict, sometimes aggressive leadership style. Yet now, for the first time in years, he felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He realized that his behavior had not only been a professional mistake, it had been an outright disrespect to someone he didn't even bother to get to know. Calloway stared down at his hands resting on the desk and frowned. He tried to understand where his reaction had come from. Of course, he was angry about the disorganization in the clinic, about the misplaced files, but there was also a deeper, more personal reason. Jessica's arrival posed a threat to his familiar way of life. She was young, confident, and poised to change things, everything that challenged his authority. As he reflected on the past, Calloway realized that the years of unquestioned leadership had blinded him to the changes happening around him. His methods had worked in the past, but now the landscape was different. and he needed to adapt or risk being left behind. He understood that there were others in the clinic who might take his side, but he also knew that his rash behavior might alienate even those who had once supported him. The longer he sat in silence, the clearer it became to Calloway. This wasn't just a conflict with a new boss. It was a confrontation with a system that was changing before his eyes. His old attitudes and methods were becoming obsolete, and if he didn't change with the times, he would be left behind. Taking a deep breath, James rose from his chair and walked over to the window. He gazed out at the street, watching as people passed by the clinic. He knew he had a difficult decision ahead. Either he would learn to work in this new reality, or he would lose everything he had worked for. For the first time in a long while, he felt real anxiety about his future. After leaving the clinic floor, Jessica Harris still felt the emotions from her confrontation with Calloway simmering inside her. But she couldn't allow herself to relax or show any signs of weakness. Her role required more than professionalism. It demanded resilience. She knew that this wasn't just a battle against one man. It was a fight against a system that had long enabled people like Dr. Calloway to feel entitled to dominance. Jessica had faced many challenges to get where she was. Throughout her career, people had questioned her abilities simply because of her skin color or her gender. From a young age, she knew that she would have to work twice as hard to prove her worth. Her parents had always told her, "You have to be better, faster, and smarter, because the world won't always be fair to you." Those words from her parents came to mind now. They had been her constant support throughout her journey. Her mother, a former teacher, and her father, a lifelong factory worker, had always stressed that education and inner strength were the keys to overcoming any obstacles. It was because of them that Jessica had decided to become a doctor. She wanted not only to heal people, but also to change the world, starting with the healthcare system that often failed minorities. When Jessica entered her office, she allowed herself a few seconds to close her eyes and take a deep breath. She felt the weight of the day, but she also felt each victory making her stronger. This incident with Calloway wasn't the first, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But she had no intention of backing down. Her mission was far more significant than her personal feelings. She remembered her time in medical school when she had been one of the few African American students in her class. Even then, she had faced doubts from classmates and even some professors. But she had always maintained her confidence because she knew her path wouldn't be easy. Every exam, every internship was a test of her resilience, and she had passed them all. Now she was here, and no one could take this position from her. Outside, the sounds of the city, cars, voices, the buzz of the clinic continued, but Jessica focused on the tasks ahead. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the reports and schedules that needed analysis. There were too many problems in the clinic, and her main job was to streamline operations. It required not just organizational skills but also diplomacy with those, like Calloway, who were resistant to change. She couldn't shake the thought that behind Calloway's opposition was a deep fear of change. People like him were afraid of losing their power and control. But Jessica knew that if she could convince even the skeptics like him that change would benefit everyone, she had a chance to make a real impact on the clinic. A few minutes later, her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was her husband, Mark. His voice always provided a sense of calm and support. He worked as a lawyer and often faced similar biases at work, so he understood what Jessica was going through. "How was your day?" he asked, though he could already tell from her tone that it had been a difficult one. "It wasn't easy," Jessica replied, "but it's only the beginning. I faced resistance, as expected, one of the doctors. He's clearly not ready for change." Mark paused before responding. "You knew it would be tough, but I know you'll handle it. You've always handled it. Remember how much you've already overcome to get here." His words gave Jessica the encouragement she needed. He was right. She had faced far greater challenges before and had come out stronger. This was her fight for justice, for improving the clinic, and for proving that an African American woman could lead and succeed. "Thank you, Mark," she said with a smile. "You're right. I've got this." When the call ended, Jessica returned to her work with renewed focus. Her motivation had solidified, She would not only fight against the prejudice she encountered, but also prove that she deserved to be exactly where she was. When Jessica returned home after the exhausting day, she was greeted by the joyful sound of her children's laughter. Her kids, Maya and Daniel, were playing in the living room with their father, Mark, who had just returned from work. As soon as they saw their mom at the door, the children rushed over to hug her. This moment was a brief oasis of peace, helping Jessica maintain her strength in difficult times. Mark approached her, noticing the tired look in her eyes. "Rough day?" he asked softly, resting a hand on her shoulder. Jessica nodded, setting her bag down and exhaling. "Tough, but I'm handling it," she answered with a slight smile, trying to hide the stress that had built up throughout the day. She knew her children shouldn't see her worries. During dinner, Jessica shared with Mark what had happened with Dr. Calloway earlier that day, how he had tried to humiliate her in front of everyone, only to find out that she was his boss. There was bitterness in her voice, but also a strong resolve. Jessica had accepted that this was part of her journey. Mark listened carefully, not interrupting her. He knew she needed to express her feelings and understood the struggle she was facing. He had encountered injustice and bias many times in his career as a black lawyer. After a pause, he looked her in the eyes and said, "You knew this would be inevitable. Anytime someone like you rises to a position of power, there will always be people who try to bring you down. But you've already proven that you deserve this role. And remember, you're not alone in this fight." Jessica smiled gratefully at him. Mark's support had always been one of her greatest sources of strength, especially during moments like these. He understood her like no one else could. Their daughter Maya, who had been listening intently, chimed in with wide-eyed innocence. "Mom, you're so strong. You'll show them you can do it." Her childlike faith in her mother made Jessica laugh, the tension she had been holding on to slowly melting away. Maya's simple words reminded Jessica of why she was doing all of this, for her children's future, for a world where they wouldn't face obstacles because of the color of their skin. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jessica and Mark stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table together. Jessica made herself a cup of tea and sat down across from him. "I feel like this is going to be a long battle," she said thoughtfully. "Calloway isn't the only one who will resist change. There are plenty of people in the clinic who are set in their ways, clinging to the old system, but I can't let them win." Mark nodded, his face serious, but filled with confidence in her. "You're going to change that clinic, Jess. You've always known that your work isn't just about treating patients. It's about transforming the system, the world we live in." Jessica knew he was right. This was not just a long road ahead. It was her mission. She wasn't just fighting for her position. She was fighting for respect and equal rights for everyone in the healthcare system. And no matter how hard it was going to be, she was prepared to see it through to the end. Her strength always came from the support of her family and community. She knew that at home, she had a solid foundation, and in the clinic, she could rely on the people who understood the importance of what she was trying to accomplish. These thoughts gave her the confidence she needed as she fell asleep that night. The day after the heated exchange, Jessica returned to work, fully focused on her tasks. She knew she would continue facing resistance from some of the staff, but that didn't deter her from carrying out her responsibilities with unwavering determination. However, Dr. Calloway couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He felt as though he had lost control of the situation, and it rattled him deeply. After several hours of contemplation, Calloway decided he needed to speak to Jessica privately. He needed to confront his inner conflict and find a way to resolve it. Summoning the courage, he made his way to her office and knocked on the door. Jessica looked up from her paperwork, surprised to see Calloway standing in the doorway. "Dr. Calloway, how can I help you?" she asked, her tone calm, though she was clearly prepared for a serious conversation. Calloway stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and hesitated for a moment. It was difficult for him to start a conversation that challenged his usual confidence. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Dr. Harris, I'd like to apologize for my behavior yesterday." His voice was quiet and strained as he carefully chose his words. "I was out of line, I let my emotions take control, and I disrespected you. That was unprofessional." Jessica studied him closely, her expression neutral. She knew these kinds of moments required careful handling. This apology could be an attempt to salvage his reputation. But there was something genuine in his words, something more personal. "Apology accepted," she said gently, pausing to ensure he understood that this wasn't just a formality. "But understand, Dr. Calloway, this is not just about your attitude toward me. It's about respecting everyone who works here. If we're going to improve patient care, we need to be a team. Otherwise, we'll only get in each other's way and, worse, harm those who need our help." Calloway stood still, her words hitting their mark. He realized that his discontent had not only undermined his authority, but had also threatened the success of the entire clinic. "I understand," he muttered, this time his voice steadier. "I've been working a certain way for a long time. Old habits. They're not easy to break. But I see now that things are changing, and to be honest, I know you're here to make this place better. That's what matters." Jessica nodded, feeling that the conversation was moving in the right direction. She decided to extend an olive branch. "I don't expect you to change overnight, Dr. Calloway. I know this will take time, but we have to work together. Your experience and insight are valuable to this clinic. If we can collaborate, I'm confident we can make some real progress." This conversation was a new experience for Calloway. In the past, leadership had always been about authority and control, but Jessica offered a different approach, one based on collaboration and mutual respect. It was a challenge to his usual way of thinking, but also an opportunity to grow and adapt. Calloway nodded again, more firmly this time. "Thank you, Dr. Harris. I'll work on this, and I'll do everything I can to help you with the changes you're trying to make. This is a new chapter for me too, but I'm ready." Jessica smiled, feeling she had made the first breakthrough in turning things around, not just for the clinic, but for Dr. Calloway as well. "I'm glad to hear that. We can achieve a lot if we work together," she said. When Calloway left her office, Jessica let out a small sigh of relief. The conversation could have gone in a completely different direction, but now, she felt like she had a real chance to build a team, even with those who had initially resisted change. Several weeks passed after Jessica's meeting with Dr. Calloway. The changes in the clinic were slow but noticeable. The staff began to adjust to Jessica's leadership style, which emphasized teamwork and mutual respect. She wasn't just managing processes, she was actively involved in them, showing through her actions how the clinic could be improved for the benefit of the patients. Still, Jessica knew there was a long way to go. One of the most significant achievements was seeing Dr. Calloway, who had once been her greatest adversary, slowly transform. He no longer made snide remarks or undermined her authority. In fact, he began to listen more, participating in team discussions and even offering suggestions for improving the clinic's efficiency. He was still the same demanding doctor, but his approach had softened, becoming more professional and collaborative. A turning point came during a staff meeting when Jessica presented a proposal to enhance care for patients with chronic illnesses, many of whom came from underserved communities. This project was one of Jessica's personal initiatives, based on her experience working with low-income families who couldn't afford adequate health care. When Jessica presented her proposal, the room went quiet. Some of the doctors exchanged skeptical glances, unsure if the idea would gain traction. But to everyone's surprise, it was Dr. Calloway who spoke up in support. "Dr. Harris is right," he began, his voice steady and clear, immediately drawing the attention of his colleagues. "For too long we've been stuck in outdated practices, ignoring the real needs of our community. I support her initiative and believe it's exactly what we need to make our clinic better." His words took the room by surprise. Some of the doctors looked at him with disbelief. Calloway, the one who had once opposed any form of change, was now openly endorsing Jessica's vision. Jessica met his gaze across the room, and in that moment, she knew her persistence was paying off. Even the most resistant opponents could change when approached with patience and respect. After the meeting, Several staff members approached Jessica to express their support for her plan. It was a small but significant victory. Slowly but surely, the clinic was transforming, and Jessica knew this was just the beginning. However, one of the most touching moments came when she received a letter from a patient who had benefited from the new programs. The patient came from one of the disadvantaged neighborhoods that Jessica had fought so hard to serve. In the letter, the patient expressed deep gratitude for the attention and care they had received, something that had been out of reach for years. This letter symbolized Jessica's triumph, not just over the system, but over her own doubts. She knew her work was far from over, but she could already see the real impact of her efforts. In time, the clinic became a model for others in the city. Thanks to Jessica and her team, many patients who had long been neglected were finally receiving the quality healthcare they deserved. The atmosphere within the staff improved, with a greater sense of unity and purpose. Dr. Calloway, once a fierce critic, became one of Jessica's strongest allies. He actively contributed to the clinic's reforms, sharing his expertise and helping implement new treatment methods. Their collaboration became a symbol of how change was possible when approached with reason and perseverance. As Jessica looked back on her journey, she realized that all the challenges had been worth it. Her work had not only changed the clinic, but had also shifted the mindset of those who had once opposed her. She had proven that with resilience, the support of family, and unwavering dedication to justice, real change was achievable.